Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the Vikings, a medieval people from the northern Scandinavian region of Europe whose exploits and migrations from the late 8th century through the 12th century, ranging from England to Russia to North Africa and everywhere in between, transformed history. For Europe, the effects were immense. The Vikings brought with them, often at the end of a sword, a pagan religion that would be incorporated into the lives of many throughout the continent, and the influence of a Proto-Germanic language that would aid in the development of such modern languages as English, German, Dutch, Norwegian, and others. Though the Vikings heavily influenced Europe 1,000 years ago, they still remain in history a distinct and even a peculiar people. Their gods worshipped other gods, and even their gods could not escape fate, and that the entire universe, gods, people, the sun, the moon, everything would perish. For this conversation, we are joined by an archaeologist who has been researching the Vikings for decades now. Neil Price is Distinguished Professor and Chair of Archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. He is the author of the book, Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. He joins us via Zoom. Neil Price, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thanks, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin by talking about who the Vikings were. Very simple question. Usually, I bet you get this at the very beginning of each interview. But we also know of the Vikings in the popular imagination, in film, in comic books. Talk me through who the Vikings were and maybe compare it to our popular imagination of who they were.
I think that probably the driest, most boring way of saying who they were is that they're the people who lived in what is now Scandinavia between about 750 and 1100, 1050, something like that. But all of those things are artificial. You know, Scandinavia as a concept didn't exist. They didn't use that calendar and so on. And then we run into problems with the word Viking, because if we could get in a time machine and go and talk to them and say, did you know you live in the Viking age? They'd be very confused. The word Viking itself, it comes from the Old Norse word vikingar, which means something like pirate. It's not quite as negative as maybe that word would be now, but it refers to people who sort of participate in raiding at sea. And there are lots of different ideas about where that actual word comes from. But what is clear is that it didn't apply to everybody in Scandinavia. It's a term that we're kind of stuck with. Every Viking scholar at some point in their books or their papers has to explain what they mean by Viking. And now it's just a shorthand for the people who lived in Scandinavia during that time.
I saw in your book, Viking, the Old Norse word, also referred to potentially bay people, like a body of water, a bay, the people of a bay.
Yeah, even now in the Scandinavian languages, the word vik means a bay of the sea. And there is an idea that Viking, it means something like a bay person, people who sort of hide in bays of the sea and then sort of come out to attack passing shipping, for example, something like that. But that's just one of many different ideas, and we don't really know exactly what it means. But it's a kind of a lifestyle as well. You can go Viking, and it's important to think that to realize that the sort of actual Vikings, it's a pursuit that you can take up and you can also stop. You can go and do something else, and then you can be a Viking again, or you can retire. And I guess the most important thing that when we talk about the Vikings, as meaning the people of Scandinavia at that time, is to remember that most of them stayed at home, never went anywhere, and never did any harm to anyone. So our kind of modern view of the Vikings as being these sort of fierce sea raiders, it only applied to some of the people of the time.
What about the stereotype of the Vikings being these sort of ruthless pirates?
I think if you were on the receiving end of a Viking raid, that stereotype would fit pretty well. I'm always very careful not to minimize the reality behind that stereotype, because it was real. The raids were immensely destructive. There are entire European kingdoms that are going down like dominoes. in front of the Viking raids, and later when they expanded into military campaigns, really. But again, just like the word Viking, it applies to a portion of the population, not the population as a whole. And another thing here is that there is no kind of Viking state in the same way that we might talk about one of the European empires, for example, like the Franks or whatever. At the beginning of the Viking Age, Scandinavia is divided up into lots of little tiny states. We don't really know what to call them, whether they're little kingdoms or something like that, competing with each other and fighting and absorbing each other and expanding or contracting. So the Vikings, as we see them, the people that go out on the raids and the campaigns and so on, they're connected with that, but they're also in part independent of it. So there's a lot of individuals all pursuing their own agendas or with their own ideas about what they want to do, all at the same time. It's a confusing picture, but that confusion is something we need to sort of embrace if we're going to get closer to the Vikings, I think.
Were the Vikings raiding on behalf of, whether it be a small kingdom, a warlord, a feudal lord, or were they just doing it on their own? Or all of the above? I mean, it sounds like that's where you were going.
I think
there.
All of the above, actually. We know that the first raids are quite small. It's a matter of just a few ships, but even that is probably a couple of hundred guys. Whether they're put together as something opportunistic by a local ruler who just decides that this is a good way to make some fast cash. And then you have all the people on the ships who might be doing that for all kinds of personal reasons. The same reasons as people might join the army or in earlier times become pirates, all kinds of things. Lots of different reasons for doing that. And then I think as you go further into the 8th century, into the 700s, nothing succeeds like success. And when these guys are coming back to Scandinavia, and maybe a few of them are missing, but the ones that are still around have got an awful lot of very expensive things with them. And their friends who didn't go on that raid might think, are you going again next summer? Yeah, maybe we'll build one more ship. And then over time, I think the people who organize that, it starts to change from local landowners to the people they answer to, and then to the people they answer to, and so on. But there's also a sense in which when you get into the Viking Age proper, when there's really thousands of Vikings, there is no single state that has the power to send out that number of people. So we're not talking about the Vikings as being the Danes or the Norwegians. They're not the anybodies. They are themselves. So when you get the big raiding armies, this is the ones that are really sort of taking out the English kingdoms and fighting through Francia and so on. They're kind of pursuing their own agenda. They're almost like little mobile states in their own right. So it's a tangled web.
Is there something about the region of North Europe where the Vikings come from that kind of creates this dynamic of becoming at least, again, probably a minority even, a raiding people? I mean, what was the terrain rough? Was farming difficult? Was agriculture, a challenge?
Yeah, it depends on where you are. Denmark is very low lying. It's fantastic agricultural land. I mean, it's a really good place to live and farm. If you go to Sweden, there are lots of forests, enormous forests that in the Viking Age are not impenetrable, but they're difficult to deal with. They're resources, but they're not places you really live. But there are big agricultural plains as well, so there's lots of good farmland. And that gets less and less the further north you go, then it really goes into forest. But in Norway, there's hardly any agricultural land. About 5% of the country is cultivatable, and that's along the edges of the fjords. And these inland waterways, the fjords that Norway is famous for today, they can give you lots of resources, but they're hard to live in. So it depends where you are. Some parts of the country or some parts of the region are very marginal. in terms of subsistence and how easy it is to live there. But other parts are great. So there isn't any single factor that means that people are sort of predisposed to go raiding. I think it's partly social factors. They've also probably been doing this for a long time, not just in Scandinavia. I mean, it's the rest of Europe is not a peaceful place. So I don't think there's anything exceptional in that sense in the Vikings that makes them want to do this. I think it's a combination of lots of different factors in their political system, their legal system. There are lots of incentives for people to do this. And then, as I said earlier, the success of those raids starts to snowball after a while. And I think the very fragmentation of Scandinavia, the fact that there isn't a king of the Vikings, means that actually an awful lot of people are more freed up for independent action. Whereas if a fleet of English raiders or Frankish raiders decided to really do something drastic with another country, that becomes a political act that will have political consequences at home as much as abroad, in a way that it doesn't for the Vikings. Because what those guys from 50 miles up the coast does is really none of your business, and then they'll come back and you think, well, that seemed to work, didn't it? So then maybe you'll do it as well. And that very fragmentation of their politics helps to drive that, I think.
Do you think it also leads to why we have such a savage notion of the Vikings? Sort of a lack of accountability of their acts?
I think that probably comes through in the accounts of the time. One of the there's two things here. The first is that the Vikings didn't write their own histories. They weren't illiterate. They had a very sophisticated runic alphabet, these angular letters, that they used to carve into wood and stone. And they either used them for stone memorials to the dead, which tend to be quite laconic. They're just quite brief notes about who was buried here or whatever, or little everyday notes carved into wood and used for lists and little messages to pass to each other. But they don't use books, so they don't write their own histories. And the famous sagas, or these wonderful stories of the North, they are Scandinavian products, or they're from Iceland, but they're from after the Viking Age. They're from the Middle Ages, so centuries after the time of the Vikings. So our contemporary sources are from outside Scandinavia, and they're almost all written from the point of view of the people who are on the receiving end of Viking violence. So our view of the Vikings, even all these centuries later, it really begins with the descriptions of what they did being written by the people they did it to. So our kind of savage view of the Vikings, it begins right there. They were perceived as obviously extremely violent, unpredictable, and that's worrying in itself because they're so mobile. You know that they're approaching because you see the sails, basically. Also, as very much not Christian. The people around the Vikings, at least in the West, are firmly Christian by this time. All the different kingdoms of England, up in what's now Scotland, in what's now France and Germany and the Netherlands, they're all Christian cultures. So to be confronted with people acting in such a dramatic way who don't share that belief system, who don't share those values, even the ideas of what it's right or wrong to do, is also particularly terrifying. And when you put all that together, I think right there is where our perception of the Vikings begins, and it has carried on ever since.
Some of the most interesting historical accounts of the Vikings comes from Arab scholars. Can you tell me about the Vikings in the East and in North Africa, and who some of these Arab scholars were and what they had to say?
Yeah. Unlike the sources in the West from the Christian states, they tend to be kind of, there's lots of different ones, but they tend to be official accounts, kind of official histories of what happened in this year and that year. That they're quite dry, and they're kind of political documents. Whereas the Arab sources, they're written by individuals who are journeying out from what's now the Middle East and encountering Vikings on the move. And these Arab writers, they're often geographers, they can be poets, Some of them are diplomats, soldiers, people sort of moving around, and their accounts are much more personal than the ones we get from the West, and that's why they're so interesting to us. And they're really eyewitness accounts of interactions with the Vikings. So some of the best sources come from Arab encounters with the Vikings on the Volga River. This is the river that goes down into the Caspian Sea, and it's one of the water roads that takes you into the Middle East. Ultimately, it connects with the caravan routes that go over land and so on. And so we have these encounters between Arab travelers and mobile Vikings, and they're intensely vivid. They describe what they look like, their hygiene habits, their religious behavior. And there's one very famous account of a funeral of this is the classic Viking funeral in a burning longship. That pretty much is where that comes from, this account. But there's also, apart from the caliphate of the Abbasids it's based in what's now Iraq. Apart from that, there's also an Arab polity in what's now Spain and Portugal, and extending down into North Africa. And you mentioned the Vikings in North Africa. We tend to see the Vikings, I think, in a kind of Northwestern European context, around the North Sea and so on, and into the North Atlantic, ultimately ending up in North America, as you know. But they also went south. And as part of their campaigns in Francia, what's now France, they had bases on the rivers there. And they used those bases to send fleets southward around the coast of Spain and Portugal, and ultimately into the Mediterranean, past Gibraltar. And there's one very spectacular expedition in the very late 850s, 860, something like that, that goes through the Straits of Gibraltar and raids along the North African coast in what's now Morocco. And they take prisoners for ransom. They enslave people. They burn down settlements and so on. And there are a number of Arab sources from southern Spain, from the Arab Emirate there, that describe this raid. And you can pick up its course in documents all along the Mediterranean shore. So they sort of turn north again and raid in southern France. They raid in the islands like Ibiza and Mallorca. They raid in northern Italy. They disappear for a year or so, and they might even get to Egypt. There's one source that says that they go to Alexandria, and then they eventually come all the way back and go back through the Straits of Gibraltar with a bit of a battle on the way. And so there's this southern dimension to the Viking world as well. It's absolutely vast area.
We began by talking about the difference between who archaeologists believe the Vikings actually were and our popular notion of the Vikings. And I think this is important, and we've been basically talking about this ever since, because the stories about the Vikings come from everyone but the Vikings themselves. Of the historiography of the Vikings, this is the history of how a story is told. And I want to work our way back, but actually start in contemporary times. And there are many different stories today of the Vikings. I mean, there are movies about Thor that are very popular. Several movies about Thor. So that, there are very mainstream accounts, but there are also very fringe kind of accounts of the Vikings. And this is something that we have been noticing here in the United States in recent years, of sort of fringe white supremacist groups taking up the symbols of the Vikings. And my understanding is that this is actually not necessarily a new dynamic. This is something we can trace back to Adolf Hitler. This is probably we could trace all the way back to, I guess, the age of scientific racism. Can you tell me about your thoughts on what you think is important to know about sort of extreme white supremacist groups and their affinity towards the Vikings?
I think that for anybody studying the Vikings, it's really important to be aware of all this. We can't just keep this as a sort of in an academic box and say, no, I study the Viking Age. I'm not interested in any of this. We have to deal with the Vikings' legacies, exactly of the kind that you've described. I think the most important thing to understand about this, about, as you say, the white supremacist use of Viking symbols and the idea of a Nordic purity and all of this, is that it says nothing at all about the actual Viking Age. Nothing. this is a phenomenon of our times and relatively recent times. It's not connected with the actual Viking Age at all. It does have its antecedents, its own history. It really took its sharpest turn during the Nazi regime in Germany. They were very keen on Vikings. Lots of books published about them. They sponsored excavations of Viking sites, took up the symbols and so on. And it's really from that today's far right use of this stems. But it even goes longer back into the past as well, because in the 18th and 19th centuries, the sagas were rediscovered as these great northern narratives, and they were used to justify, as you say, things like scientific racism, the sort of burgeoning nationalism of the northern countries, and not least Victorian England, looking for their own connections in the north. So those, you can follow this back quite a long way into the past. I think I'd probably put the beginnings of that at the sort of the late 18th century, into the 19th century. Before that, there are also appropriations of the Vikings, really ever since the Viking Age itself. But they're slightly different. They're used as almost kind of stock villains in romantic narratives. They're used, by the time you get to Shakespeare's time, they're used as characters in dramas, as a sort of agents in the story of England's greatness and all of this. And then alongside that, there's also something that also continues today, because it's not all negative. You mentioned the Thor movies, which I think are great. There is another side to the Vikings as stories, as characters. And I think it's important also to recognize that there is something of value in the fact that we're still talking about these people who've been dead for 1,000 years. So there's that interest in the Vikings, which I think one has to respect. But as you say, the political appropriation of them is a huge problem.
What would the Vikings have had a sense of race the way we see race today?
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure that anybody at that time would have had a sense of that. They were quite tolerant of difference, different kinds of differences. One of the things is that if you think of it in religious terms, there's no Viking who launches a crusade, for example, in favor of converting people to non-Christian religion. Christianity comes into Scandinavia because ultimately the Scandinavians allow Christian missionaries to do their thing. And that is not happening in reverse. So there is a general tolerance. But this idea of a sort of a Nordic purity and so on is not something that we find in the Viking Age, and it's not a concept that they would have recognized at all.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Neil Price, Distinguished Professor and Chair of Archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. He is the author of the book Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. Neil Price, one of the things you write in your book, one of the things that distinguishes, among many things, you are very clear, the Vikings were different. And one of the things that really distinguishes the Vikings is their religion, a pagan religion. What is important to know about their religion?
I think probably the most important thing is that we shouldn't call it a religion. It's tempting to do that. But I think for many of us today, that concept conjures up something that's kind of like it's quite formal. And even though a lot of people's religious ideas today are quite vague, they're still constrained by an idea or a holy book or holy people who interpret that book with instructions and guidelines on how to live and so on. And the religion of the Vikings was very different. It was very flexible and very personal. And I think that there's no concept really of worship. You don't even have to like the gods very much, actually. They're more like enormously powerful forces that it's a good idea to keep on good terms with, because if you don't, it could be bad news. And that relationship between people and the others, whether those others are gods or whether they're lots of little, we would call them supernatural beings, but I don't think they're supernatural at all. I think they're natural for the Vikings. They're just other things that live around you. And, we might talk about, animals. So there's fish, or there's elk or whatever. And there's elves, and there's dwarves, and there's trolls. So they're all part of this natural world. And I think that for the Vikings, they are certainly building a relationship with the gods, but they're also building a relationship with all these other things that are probably more important in their daily lives. You're not going to meet Odin on a Saturday night, but you've got to be really quite careful about that elf that lives behind your house, because it might make your cows sick, or it could blight your crops and things like that. So you leave out little gifts for them and so on. So this Viking spiritual world is kind of teeming with life. And I think the Vikings are negotiating their place in that world on a kind of everyday basis, not in the same way as constructing a religious idea to follow. It's a conception of reality itself. So I think that's what I'd say there.
Odin, this is sort of the most powerful god of many gods. He's a fascinating god. I think one of the most fascinating gods I have studied. Here is a god who is a very flawed god, very flawed character who can't escape his own desires and his own self-image and these things. Yet at the same time, he is obsessed with wisdom, which seems to be contradictory in a way there, where he even gives his eye in order to find wisdom. So when you see pictures or statues of Odin, it's always with a patch on one eye, because he gave that eye away in order to seek wisdom. Tell me more about Odin.
I also find him fascinating. I think he's an extraordinary figure, a contradictory figure in many ways. He's colossally violent. He's treacherous, which is, right there. If you're talking about gods, you absolutely cannot trust this guy. He's a liar, and he deceives people. He also rewards people. He's quite funny sometimes. I think what I find most interesting about him, amidst all the contradictions, is it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the stereotype of the Vikings, this savage violence. And actually what Odin embodies more than anything else is wisdom, is knowledge, is thinking, is the power of the mind, which is not at all something we'd associate with stereotypical Vikings. And I think he stands for that sophistication that I think was also there in the Viking mind. And also the I forgot the phrase you just used, that he's a guy with issues, basically. That's also quite interesting, because he's quite vulnerable. He doesn't know everything. He has this obsession with knowledge and wisdom. As you say, he gives up his eye. He gives up all kinds of things. And one of the ways in which he finds this knowledge, he's obsessed with the future, what's going to happen at the end of the world, is he wakes up dead humans and asks them questions, especially dead women. So humans actually know more than the gods do, or at least dead humans. And right there is a complete inversion of this idea of these all-powerful gods. There's lots of things they don't know. There's lots of things they're worried about. They're insecure about things, and it's a very different view of this kind of this spiritual world than I think the one we think of. So you have gods like Thor, who are quite blunt, really, and quite violent, but others like Odin that are a lot more complicated. And Odin has a kind of mirror in Loki as well, as another character that's very famous from Marvel movies and so on. And this idea of a kind of fundamental insecurity, you have to be very sure about things as you make your way through the Viking world. That's something that comes up again and again in their mythology. And I wonder if it's a little clue to what life at the time was like. This basic insecurity. You had to be really clear about the things around you before you speak hastily and things like that.
And as I was saying, I think in the introduction, that even a god as powerful as Odin couldn't escape fate. And with you have what was called the Norns. These are, I think, three sisters. Their names in English would be past, present, and future. That sat at the tree of life. This great big Yggdrasil, I think is the name of
Yggdrasil, yeah.
Yggdrasil of the tree, and would basically stream or sew together reality, the future, and through that you could see the past. But even somebody like Odin and actually all the gods could not escape fate, and that makes me think of the Norns.
Yeah, they're strange beings. Their names are quite hard to interpret. There is this sense of past, present, and future, but it's there's a lot of debate around that. But they live at the foot of the world tree, this great ash, and it's them who keep the tree going. Actually, they put clay on its trunk to smooth it. They make sure it's got water and so on, and they are in charge of fate and destiny, and they spin each person's life. They make a sort of fabric of your life, and each thread is an action, and it sort of determines what happens to you. And then at the end of your life, they cut the final thread, and that's you. And there's parallels for them in other cultures as well. There's quite similar figures in Greek and Roman mythology, so there's a lot of indications that they are influenced by that. But this idea of fate is at least developed in the Viking mind to a very considerable degree, and everybody is trapped in it. It's not that there's no free will, and there's a Danish scholar who's done a lot of work on this. It's more that in following your fate, you inevitably become the person who you always were. So your choices lead you to where you were always supposed to go anyway, but that doesn't mean you don't have the choice. It's a strange idea. And it also stops because there's a different meaning of fate, the sort of final fate. And that's one of the things that Odin is looking for. He's always looking for clues as to what is going to happen in the future and how to prepare for it. There's another one of these contradictions actually in the Viking stories, which is that they're trying to find out what happens in the future, but actually they already know. And they're trying to deal with the inevitability of finality. It's a very fatalistic religion, very different from say Christianity or Islam.
Let's talk about that fatalism of this Norse religion, and here's something I actually first learned about, again, by another storyteller other than from a Viking, and that would be from Richard Wagner's The Ring Cycle, and which his last opera of the 4 opera series is based on Ragnarok. This is not what Wagner called it, but that's Götterdämmerung or something like that. Yeah. But this comes from the story of Ragnarok from the Norse mythology. And this is perhaps something that also distinguishes perhaps the Vikings from other people. And that is that everything comes to an end, including the gods. The gods will die in Ragnarok as well.
It's kind of like an afterlife that ends. That's a very strange concept. Many religions have some kind of afterlife, sometimes a good one or a bad one or whatever, but they kind of go on forever. And the Viking one doesn't. And what Ragnarok is, it means the twilight of the gods. It's the same as Wagner's opera title. It's a point sometime in the future when all the bad things, the frost giants and the fire giants and the drowned, all kinds of things, will get together and fight the gods. And in this battle, everything in the universe will be destroyed. So all the human beings, living and dead, all the spirits and the elves and the dwarves and the giants and the gods, everybody, everything will die in this battle. And there's lots of other aspects to it too. That there's the famous wolf Fenris that will eat Odin and all kinds of things. So there's a fantastic set of stories around this thing, but there is a kind of there's a secondary story in which actually a few people survive, and then and a couple of the gods' sons and so on, and then there's a suggestion that a new world will grow out of the old one, and there's a lot of discussion about whether that is a kind of Christian addition to the original cycle when everything did really end, and we don't know, quite simply. But this Ragnarok idea is very unusual. It's very detailed. There's lots and lots of stories about this. It's referenced on rune stones from the Viking Age, so we know this really is a Viking Age story, even though our sources for it are medieval. People must have thought about this. They must have thought about what will happen to them when they die eventually, and they might go to Asgard, this is where the gods live, or they might go to Hell, which is this rather sort of dark place under the ground, or whatever. But wherever they went, in the end, Ragnarok was still going to be there. It's a very curious idea of eternity with limits. And there is a suggestion which goes back to, your very first question about how, where the Vikings come from, who they are. That there's been some ideas that the stories of Ragnarok reflect a kind of social collapse several centuries before the time of the Vikings, in the mid-6th century, so it's roughly 200 years before the Viking Age. Partly with all kinds of political factors and things. It's when the Roman Empire is slowly coming apart and all the places around it are feeling the effects of that, with economic difficulties and disruptions to supply chains and things, kind of things we worry about. It's the same kind of thing. But also there is a kind of environmental disaster caused by volcanic eruptions of enormous magnitude and there's a lot of debate around this, I should say, but they seem to have had an absolutely catastrophic effect on agriculture in Scandinavia. Remember that it's a very marginal climate, actually. And if you don't have to lower the temperature by too many degrees before it starts to get really dicey, especially places like Norway. And it seems that there is massive famine, starvation. There is an enormous loss of life. Some of the estimates put it as great as 50%. This is really bad. And there is a kind of relatively short-lived social collapse. And it's from the kind of rubble, if you like, of that the society that becomes the Vikings gradually builds itself up. And part of that climate disaster, that environmental disaster caused by the volcanoes, is related to a veil of dust generated by the volcanic eruptions that blots out the light of the sun. And one of the features of the Ragnarok myth is that it begins with a darkened sun and a winter that goes on and on for several years, which is very similar to the things that we have described about that climate disaster in Roman sources and things like that. So there is this idea that in some way Ragnarok is a kind of memory, a distant memory of when it really must have felt as if the world was coming apart. And 200 years later, this has become a story of how it might one day end. It's another clue to this very sort of particular mindset of the Vikings.
Recognizing there's still a debate about the connection to these volcanic activities in the 6th century to Ragnarok, but when I was reading that section in your book, I couldn't help. I live in California in the United States, where every fall now we have great fires, and last year the smoke was so intense the sky went orange, and you couldn't see the sun even in a cloudless day. And everyone who went through that experience will tell you how eerie and strange that was. And that was just for a few weeks, never mind a prolonged period of time to really disrupt agriculture and everything. So for me, just imagining it, which of course doesn't prove it, but just imagining it makes me think that, yeah, I could see how you'd have some great stories coming out of such a
plus
apocalyptic
the fact that
type.
everybody in everybody in California knew what was happening.
That's right.
But imagine if you didn't.
That's right.
If the sky had just gone strange or gone dark or gone orange or whatever. Actually, you know that famous painting, The Scream, by Edvard Munch, with the character holding its face on the bridge. What that actually relates to is an experience that Munch had when he was in Oslo, and the skies really looked as vivid and red and terrible as they do in that painting after a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. So we actually have a visual record of what that really looked like and what it felt like. And the famous line when Munch described his feelings that resulted in that painting, it felt as if a great scream went through all of nature. And I think that's what the Vikings were seeing and trying to cope with. And there is this this concept called geomythology, where natural events are incorporated into myths as a means of trying to explain what it was that had happened. It's hard to study, it's hard to prove, and we have to be very clear about that. But it's quite an interesting thought. And in some of the Ragnarok stories, some of the objects, the things that are described, are more like things from the 500s than they are from the Viking Age. So it suggests that there is older stories behind that myth.
I'd like to spend our remaining time talking about the influence that the Vikings had, especially on Europe. And I guess I want to begin in England. This is where you're joining me from Sweden, but you're from England, and my understanding is this is where your entryway into the Vikings, because the Vikings do go and not only raid England but eventually settle. But my first question actually begins before the Viking era. I always just kind of assumed that the Anglo-Saxons, a group of people sort of from the same region of the world who had come a few hundred years earlier to England and sort of with their influence create a modern England. I always thought that the Anglo-Saxons were somewhat related to the Vikings. Is that not accurate?
Yeah, it is. There is there's a common cultural background. The people who begin to come to England the dating is not that secure, but into the sort of the 5th century, the 400s, it's as Roman power starts to slip. They're certainly coming from, amongst other places, what's now southern Denmark and northern Germany. There is a common cultural background. And I've actually thought that one of the reasons why the later English find the Vikings so frightening is because they find them a little bit familiar. And I think the Christian English have a kind of very sharp reminder of kind of what they used to be and maybe a little bit still were. And I think there is that connection there between the English peoples and the Vikings. But by the time of the Viking Age itself, there is a very distinct gap there. And when, like the famous King Alfred, when he's fighting wars with the Vikings, fighting for the future of the English kingdoms, there is a Norwegian merchant who turns up at the English court. And there's a wonderful account been left by Alfred's scribes of the interview he had with the English king. And it seems that Alfred doesn't really know very much about the people he's fighting a war with, because he's saying, who are you? Where do you come from? And how do you live? And kind of basic questions. He's very curious. So I think by the time you get into the Viking Age itself, there is quite a gap there, but based on something that was once familiar.
Help me understand what is meant by Germanic people. Of course, we think automatically of modern-day Germany, which is a very modern state. But when we look, especially in the Old World, in the ancient world especially, we see Europe, Central Europe, largely populated by what we call Gauls or Celts, that the Germanic people would actually come from the north, also come into England. English is a Germanic language, as are many other European languages. Who were the Germanic people, and how did they spread?
I think that, well, for a start, this is a kind of just a minefield of terminology, because there are terms for languages and groups of languages. there are terms that have been used for people, but they usually go back to a kind of political heritage of talking about cultures in terms that are essentially rather racist. And I think anybody working with the ancient peoples of Northern Europe has to wrestle with this question of what do we call them. Germanic is a term I personally tend to avoid as much as possible. Sometimes it's difficult to avoid it, but broadly speaking, by the Viking Age, it refers to the kind of broadly common heritage of the peoples of Northwestern Europe. The territories of roughly what is now Germany and into Scandinavia, and as we were just talking about with ultimately the people who became the English. But it's those kinds of concepts are things that I think are best avoided.
Why?
Because of this, as you were saying earlier, the way in which terms like this are so easily appropriated, and they're weaponized, and they're claimed to mean something that they don't. And it doesn't help that if you go back not that far into the past, so for example, the period of the war and the Third Reich, even supposedly reputable historians are using the terms in those ways. So this is a terminology that has become so infected that I think it's best to put it to one side.
How far did how influential then do you think were the Vikings for the rest of Europe when it comes both to language and religion?
In terms of religion, I think not hugely, not least because they, as we talked about, they didn't really have a religion that they were trying to spread. They had a set of ideas and a view of the world, which to some degree connected with similar ideas that had been long since kind of suppressed in Europe as Christianity took hold. But they're still there in a way in folklore and stories of magical beings and so on. It hasn't entirely gone away. There's obviously linguistic influences, lots of loan words into modern English that come from ultimately the Viking languages. I think their main legacy is really the political impact of what they did. So there was, some scholars talk about a very brief Viking empire of the North Sea. I'm not sure whether I go that far, but what happened in resistance to the Vikings, the things that the people they fought did to push back against them, that in turn created new political units and things. So England itself is partly a creation of the war against the Vikings. When the Viking armies invaded England in the 800s, England was lots of little kingdoms that the Vikings took out one by one. And broadly speaking, there was a point at which only one of the large kingdoms was left. This is Wessex and Alfred, as I mentioned. But as Alfred and his successors gradually forced the Vikings back, it wasn't that they reinstated all the little kingdoms that the Vikings had taken out. Everything became a kind of greater Wessex and ultimately England. So you can see those kinds of legacies. And there are some places like Normandy in France, which is still retains its borders from the Viking Age when it was a Viking colony. So there's all kinds of little legacies like that. Perhaps most of all in the North Atlantic. So Iceland, for example, is a creation of the Viking Age, and still has a very, very clear heritage to that time. The settlement of Greenland, for example, is also something that is ultimately from Scandinavia at the same time as others are coming in from the north. So there's a lot of legacies like that. But I say their legacies are very varied. I think this, when I was trying to give you an idea of the Viking Age is something confusing, which is not a very good thing to try and sort of get a message across. It's complicated, basically, but it is, and I think to embrace that complexity is far more positive than to say look for simple causes and simple legacies. So it's this tremendously varied, diverse set of things that ultimately sort of go back to the Viking Age.
One last question, and that is about Iceland, and really kind of a two-part question. This is where we have Snorri Sturluson, man who the 13th century would write down many of these Nordic myths. But I've also heard that Iceland, and I don't know if this is out of your realm or not, and you'll let me know if so, but Iceland has the oldest, could be arguably the oldest democracy in the world that ranges in about 1,000 years of age. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's got the oldest sitting parliament.
Called the All thing?
That's right. Yeah, this word it's unfortunate that it means something different in English, but the thing is a popular assembly. It's going a little far to call it democracy, but it's essentially a set of elected representatives from different districts and communities who meet at regular intervals to decide what should be done about issues of the day, to settle legal disputes, things like that. And there are lots of these things, these assemblies all over Scandinavia at lots of levels. So there's very local ones, there's regional ones, there's bigger ones, and so on. And in Iceland, the all thing, which is the big thing, the thing for the whole country, it was based at a place called Thingvellir, which is a kind of lava plain not far from Reykjavik. And the Icelandic parliament today is still the All Thing. There are other ones on the Isle of Man, for example, in the Irish Sea. There's the mound where the Thing assembly met is still there. There's lots of these all over Scandinavia. So the Icelanders are very proud of this, justifiably proud of this long legacy of something resembling parliamentary democracy. And it's a pretty much unbroken line. So you can still go to Thingvellir today and see the rock where the law speaker stood and so on. That's absolutely real.
Yeah, I guess though in the older days, the assembly was made up of chieftains rather than elected officials.
Yeah, in the or people representing their communities. So when you read the saga accounts, many of which include legal disputes, it's this full of stories of the leading families trying to nudge the law in one direction or another, or buy influence, or threaten people, and so on. So it's very much an imperfect system, but and it represents largely the elites. But it does provide a channel for a kind of popular involvement in the law and in politics. And the great thing about Iceland, the really, really innovative thing, is that there is no king. So it's a republic of farmers, essentially, some of whom are considerably more wealthy than others, but still it's a republic of farmers in an age of kings. And that makes it a real exception.
Should this be seen as a legacy of the Vikings?
The Icelanders absolutely would, yeah. And it's, I think, probably the one country in the world that has the closest link to its Viking past. Even today, Icelanders have patronymic surnames. So instead of surnames like ours, a man's surname is the name of his father, with son after, and dottir for a daughter. So Icelanders don't actually use surnames because they change. So everyone uses their first names. This is a Viking custom. We used to have it in Scandinavia, but not anymore.
I mean, we have it here too, in such names as Jefferson, Harrison. I mean, just all names that, I mean, they don't change here anymore, but
they were once like that. Yeah. Same here. Yeah, Anderson or whatever.
Yeah. Neil Price has been our guest. Neil Price, Distinguished Professor and Chair of Archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. He has joined us for a conversation on his book, Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. Neil Price, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. Good to talk.